A wooden ship is no match for 10,000 tons of lateral pressure. In 1915, the Endurance wasn't just trapped, it was being digested by a thermodynamic vacuum. As the Weddell Sea solidified, the hull became a structural impurity in a shifting tectonic plate of ice. 28 men were left with 0 ships, negative 20-degree temperatures, and a 500-day biological countdown. This wasn't a triumph of spirit, it was a forensic negotiation with the physical states of water. The unforgiving variable was the pack ice lock. Escape was rendered mechanically impossible not by distance, they were less than 500 kilometers from the nearest land, but by the friction of the medium. To march across the pack meant hauling 1,000-kilogram lifeboats over hummocks, pressure ridges of jagged ice rising 3 meters high. To stay meant waiting for a seasonal thaw that the Southern Ocean's current was actively delaying. The geography was a kinetic trap. The Weddell Sea rotates in a clockwise gyre, a slow-motion whirlpool that kept the men 1,500 kilometers from the nearest human presence, drifting at a rate of only 5 to 7 kilometers per day. At these latitudes, the Antarctic serves as a planetary heat sink. In a mean temperature of minus 20 Celsius, the human body becomes a furnace burning itself for fuel. To maintain a core temperature of 37 Celsius, the metabolic rate must triple. Without a constant intake of high lipid fuels, the body begins a systematic shutdown. Peripheral vasoconstriction pulls blood from the fingers and toes to protect the vital organs, initiating the first stage of localized necrosis. The men were not merely waiting for a rescue, they were participating in a 497-day countdown against the total depletion of their internal caloric reserves. The human system aboard the Endurance was a rigid hierarchy of specialized utility. Ernest Shackleton, the expedition leader, functioned as the central processing unit, managing the psychological stability of 27 men. His crew was an intentional mix of intellectual and manual labor. Frank Wild, the second-in-command with unparalleled ice experience, George Marston, the artist responsible for visual documentation, Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, and 2 surgeons, Alexander Macklin and James McElroy. The average age was 30. These were men selected for their capacity to endure the long daylight of the Antarctic summer and the absolute darkness of its winter. The equipment inventory was a collection of Victorian-era technology pushed to its physical limit. The primary survival assets were 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. These were double-ended whalers constructed of Baltic pine and oak. The secondary layer consisted of 18 sled dogs, biological engines capable of hauling 40 kilograms each, and a stockpile of hoosh. Hoosh was a technical ration composed of 60% lard and 40% protein, specifically engineered to provide 5,000 calories per day to men engaged in heavy sledging. This fuel was supplemented by 1,300 kilograms of seal blubber, a substance that served as both a high-lipid food source and a crude combustible for heating. As the mission was the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, a 2,900-kilometer trek from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea via the South Pole. In 1914, this was the final global map challenge. However, as the ship became a permanent fixture of the ice, the scope of the mission narrowed from a transcontinental crossing to the individual's pulse. The focus shifted from the vast white geography to the internal metabolic management of 28 pairs of extremities. The survival of the group now depended on a single metric: the prevention of peripheral heat loss and the maintenance of a positive caloric balance in a landscape that offered 0 natural shelter. The destruction of the Endurance was a forensic progression of timber fatigue. On October 24, 1915, the thermodynamic equilibrium of the Weddell Sea shifted. A gale from the southwest initiated a pressure wave, a kinetic ripple moving through thousands of square kilometers of pack ice. As the ice plates surged, the ship was no longer floating in water. It was being squeezed in a horizontal vise. The 10-inch thick oak frames, designed to deflect impact, began to scream under a lateral load they were never engineered to sustain. At 1845, the stern post was wrenched out of the hull, and the internal bilge pumps reached their mechanical limit, and this was the point of catastrophic failure. The chain of causality was driven by the ship's design. Its bow was rounded to ride up onto ice, but its midsection was vertical, allowing the pack to grip the hull like a wrench. As the ice leveled the ship, the structural shearing began. Decks buckled, and the main mast snapped. In a span of seconds, the Endurance transitioned from a sanctuary to a 300-ton liability. And the specific mistake that rendered the situation irreversible was the tactical assumption that the ship could outlast the winter. Shackleton had delayed the abandoned ship order until the hull was literally being shredded into kindling, leaving the crew minutes to salvage 1,300 kilograms of supplies before the cabins imploded. By 1900, the routine was dead. The crew stood on a moving ice floe, watching the ship's structural tip tilt into the slush. After the physics of gravity were now the primary enemy. As the forward compartments flooded, the ship was dragged 3,000 meters toward the seabed. The men were left with 3 lifeboats and a collection of canvas tents on a frozen surface that was only 1.5 meters thick. The mission was no longer a crossing of the continent. It was a battle against the unforgiving variable of the ice itself, which was now the only thing keeping them from the 4 degrees Celsius water of the Southern Ocean. By 2100, on October 27th, 1915, the survival of the 28 men shifted from a maritime operation to a terrestrial occupation of a floating ice shelf. The immediate tactical priority was the establishment of Ocean Camp, a temporary perimeter located approximately 500 meters from the mangled remains of the Endurance. As the physical response was dictated by the inventory and salvage protocol, every gram of high-lipid fuel and every meter of canvas was hauled onto the floe before the hull's structural integrity vanished entirely. The men recovered 1,300 kilograms of food, including hoosh, sledging rations, and cases of nut food, providing a theoretical caloric runway of several months. The technical tool introduced in this cycle was the pemmican fuel cycle. In a landscape of zero wood or coal, heat was a manufactured commodity. The men converted empty biscuit tins into blubber stoves, using the oily fat of Weddell seals as a combustible. This required a constant mechanical labor, skinning seals, dicing the blubber, and managing the soot-heavy flames. Resource management was absolute. Shackleton ordered the abandonment of all non-essential weight, including personal mementos and professional equipment, to prioritize the weight-to-traction ratio of the lifeboats, as each man was permitted only 0.9 kilograms of personal effects. Environmental variables shifted the logistics of the camp daily. The ice floe was not a stable foundation. It was a dynamic, salt-saturated sheet subject to cracking. At any moment, a lead of open water could open directly through the center of the camp, severing the supply lines between the tents and the lifeboats. The men slept on reindeer skin bags atop a layer of canvas, but the heat from their bodies created a melting variable. The ice beneath them would soften, creating a damp, freezing microclimate within the sleeping bags that prevented stage 4 REM sleep. By the end of the first month, the Ocean Camp was no longer a temporary stop. It was a drifting laboratory of human endurance, moving northward at the mercy of the Weddell Gyre. By April 1916, the Ocean Camp floe had disintegrated under the mechanical stress of the northern swells. The transition from ice to water was not a relief. It was a high-risk maritime maneuver. The 28 men were forced into the 3 salvaged whalers, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. The technical challenge of this adaptation was the freeboard variable. These open boats, roughly 6 to 7 meters in length, were now overloaded with nearly 1,000 kilograms of men and gear, leaving less than 60 centimeters of wood between the gunwale and the Southern Ocean. The primary technical tool of this cycle was ad hoc naval architecture. To survive the sub-Antarctic gales, the carpenter, Harry McNish, utilized salvaged timber from the Endurance to raise the sides of the James Caird. He sealed the seams using a mixture of flour, oil paint, and seal blood, a crude but effective caulking agent that had to withstand constant hydraulic pressure. Navigation became a forensic exercise in probability. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, was forced to use a sextant while balanced in a pitching boat under a perpetually clouded sky. A single degree of error in his longitudinal calculations would mean missing the sub-Antarctic islands and drifting into the open Atlantic. where the biological clock would inevitably run out. The environmental variable was saltwater sepsis. The men were trapped in a state of constant immersion, where the 2 degrees Celsius seawater breached the boats every few minutes. The reindeer skin sleeping bags, which were once a thermal defense, became 20-kilogram sodden weights that rotted and shed hair, clogging the manual bilge pumps. Without fresh water, the men began to experience thirst delirium. Their primary hydration source was ice floes snatched from the water, but as they moved further north, the ice became increasingly saline. By the time the jagged silhouette of Elephant Island appeared on the horizon after 5 days of open sea transit, the marine transition had stripped the crew of their remaining body fat. They were no longer an expedition. They were a collection of salt-scoured organisms clinging to 20-foot slivers of wood. On April 16, 1916, the 28 men made landfall on Elephant Island, a desolate outcrop of rock and ice. While the ground was stable, the biological tax of the preceding 6 months reached a critical threshold. The crew's metabolic state shifted from acute survival to chronic systemic failure. Without access to fresh fruit or vegetables, the biological defense against scurvy, the synthesis of vitamin C, began to fail. However, the men avoided the terminal stages of the disease through a forced adaptation, the lipid-protein pivot. By consuming the raw livers and meat of seals and penguins, they ingested enough trace nutrients and high-density fats to stave off total connective tissue collapse. The technical tool introduced in this cycle was subterranean architecture. Because the island offered no timber and the winds frequently exceeded 100 kilometers per hour, the men inverted the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills, propping them up on low stone walls to create a boat hut. The interior was a 4x6 meter lightless void, insulated by frozen seal skins and heated by the constant, oily smoke of blubber lamps. This environment introduced a new variable: soot-induced respiratory distress. The men's lungs and skin were perpetually coated in carbonized fat, leading to chronic coughing and localized infections. Physiologically, the tax manifested as maceration and necrosis. Constant exposure to frozen salt water had softened the skin of the men's feet until it began to slough off in layers, a condition known as immersion foot. For some, like Blackborough, the youngest stowaway, the biological tax was localized. The blood flow to his toes had ceased during the boat journey, leading to stage 3 gangrene. In the dim, smoke-filled hut, surgeons Macklin and McElroy performed a field amputation of 5 toes, using a limited supply of chloroform and rusted surgical steel. The human system was now fracturing. The men were no longer able to maintain the mechanical labor of survival. They were entering a state of stagnant entropy, waiting for a rescue that would require Shackleton to cross 1,300 kilometers of the world's most violent ocean in a 20-foot boat. By June 1916, the 22 men remaining on Elephant Island entered a state of psychological narrowing. Shackleton and 5 others had departed in the James Caird to seek help, leaving the remaining crew in a 4x6 meter lightless void. This was the big room effect, a total collapse of group logic caused by sensory deprivation and the lack of a horizontal plane. In the boat hut, the distinction between day and night vanished. The men lived in a permanent twilight, their world reduced to the 20 centimeters of space between their sleeping bags. The brain, starved of new stimuli, began to focus on recursive fantasies. Men would spend hours technically debating the specific ingredients of meals they would never eat. The physical failure reached its terminal stage. Immersion foot transitioned into chronic wet-cold necrosis. Because the floor of the hut was a mixture of frozen mud and seal guano, the men's feet never reached a state of thermal neutrality. The skin became a pale, translucent mass of dead tissue, susceptible to sea sores, saltwater ulcers that refused to heal because the body's autophagy was now consuming its own repair proteins to fuel the heart and lungs. The biological tax was now being paid in vitamin C synthesis. Though the seal meat provided a baseline, the lack of variety led to gingival degradation, where the gums became soft and hemorrhaged at the slightest pressure. The distortion of time became absolute. The men were no longer sailors participating in a war or an expedition. They were biological entities experiencing neurological collapse. The social structure was maintained only by the rigid enforcement of routine, the daily dicing of seal meat, and the rhythmic scraping of the blubber lamp. Every morning, Frank Wild would announce, "Get your things ready, boys, the boss may come today." This wasn't a statement of fact, but a cognitive anchor designed to prevent the men from drifting into a fatal state of give-up itis, a clinical condition where the will to maintain the mechanical action of breathing simply ceases. They were drifting in a graveyard of their own making, 400 days into a mission that had long since been erased by the ice. On August 30th, 1916, the 497th day of the biological countdown concluded with a statistical anomaly. The Yelcho, a small Chilean steam tug piloted by Captain Luis Pardo and carrying Shackleton, appeared through the fog of Elephant Island. The extraction was not a celebratory reunion. It was a high-speed logistical maneuver dictated by the ice variable. The Yelcho possessed no wireless equipment and no structural reinforcement. It was a steel-hulled vessel operating in a landscape of grinding granite-hard ice. Shackleton had only 1 hour to evacuate the 22 men before the shifting pack ice locked the tug into the same 10,000-ton vice that had claimed the Endurance. The outcome was processed with clinical precision. Of the 28 men who had entered the Weddell Sea 22 months prior, the casualty count was 0. This was a triumph of metabolic management. Despite the 1,300-kilometer open sea crossing of the James Caird and the 4-month entombment on Elephant Island, the crew had maintained a survival rate of 100%. They were hauled onto the Yelcho in a state of advanced physical decay. Their skin was permanently tattooed with blubber soot, their muscle mass was depleted by nearly 30%, and their heart rates were elevated, a symptom of chronic hypervigilance. The metric of their survival was not measured in kilometers, but in thermal neutrality and lipid intake. They had successfully navigated the 3 survival cycles. They salvaged the inventory, or they adapted the technology, and they managed the biological tax. As the Yelcho steamed north toward Punta Arenas, the men were given their first refeed protocol, a careful reintroduction of simple carbohydrates and fresh water to a digestive system that had lived on seal protein and melted ice for over a year. The Endurance mission was officially closed not by a flag at the pole, but by a tally of 28 heartbeats. The site of the failure remained a theoretical ghost for over a century. In March 2022, a research team utilizing the vessel Agulhas located the Endurance at a depth of 3,008 meters. The ship rests in the chemically neutral tomb of the Weddell Sea, where the absence of wood-boring organisms and the near-freezing, high-pressure environment has preserved the hull in a state of suspended animation. The Endurance name remains legible across the stern and the glass portholes, which shattered under the pressure of the ice in 1915, now look out onto a lightless, abyssal plain. The event fundamentally altered the human factor in polar logistics. Today, the Antarctic is a monitored grid of satellite telemetry and automated SR protocols, yet the fundamental physics of the pack ice lock remain unchanged. The 2022 discovery confirmed the forensic accuracy of Frank Worsley's hand-calculated sextant coordinates. So he was off by less than 1.5 kilometers after nearly 500 days of drifting. The 28 survivors left a legacy of biological endurance that redefined the limits of human immersion and metabolic resilience. The ship rests in total darkness, a 300-ton monument to a failed ambition and a perfect survival record. The ice has reclaimed the deck, but the record of the pressure remains.